right, thank you. So good morning, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Catherine Murphy, and I'm the science coordinator for the Middle Rio Grande Endangered Species Collaborative Program here in Albuquerque. As always, I'd like to thank each of you for taking time, especially on a Friday, to attend today's seminar. We are very honored to welcome New Mexico's state soil scientist, Rick Strait, and he's with the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. A little bit about Rick. He began his NRCS career in Arizona in 1996, and he was inventorying the soils and vegetations of the Grand Canyon, Monument Valley, and Mojave Desert. Later, he managed NRCS's regional database in Palmer, Alaska, and he was developing field tools to facilitate soil and vegetation inventory. As the New Mexico State soil scientist for the last 12 years, he manages the NRCS's inventory and assessment programs within the state, including soil survey, water supply forecasting, natural resources inventory, and plant materials. This morning, Rick is going to introduce us to the NRCS Plant Materials Program, which develops vegetative solutions for natural resource concerns such as soil stabilization, soil health and productivity, and water quality, all of which can, I'm sure, inform some of our restoration activities and other efforts within the program. As always, you can submit questions that you have using the chat feature, or you can wait and raise your hand at the end of the seminar during the Q&A. This seminar is being recorded and will be uploaded to our program portal later. And with that, I'll turn things over to Rick.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Thanks for the great introduction. I think you pretty well covered everything. I'm just going to dive right into my presentation and talk a little bit about NRCS and our plant materials program. So, all right, we have, NRCS has 25 plant materials centers nationwide. And we're very fortunate to have one in New Mexico. New Mexico Center covers more than just the state of New Mexico. Our service area, because all of the plant material centers or PMCs, the service areas are done geographically. And so ours covers most of New Mexico, except down in the Boot Heel. That's covered by Tucson. But we do cover the Four Corners region and a little bit of Texas and southern Colorado and just a tip of Oklahoma. The real goals, the reason why we're here is to develop solutions for natural resource concerns using plants. And we do that really in two different ways. One is by improving conservation plants. In the past, those could be either native or non-native plants. We have, over the decades, shifted to where now it's strictly native plants. And in addition to improving those conservation plants for restoration, which I'll talk more about, we do develop and disseminate new types of conservation planting technology. Our national priorities, in addition to the ones that were just mentioned, are improving wildlife habitat. We've got a nationwide push within the Department of Ag for increasing pollinator plants and pollinator habitat, and also cover crops, which is a real NRCS, USDA type of thing to focus on, mainly to look at improving soil health, increasing ecosystem services, and reducing erosion. A little bit of history about both the program and specifically about our center here in New Mexico. We're really launched, the entire nationwide program was launched in 1935 under the Soil Conservation Act, which was a response to the Dust Bowl. A lot of people don't associate the Dust Bowl with New Mexico, but the picture on the right side of the screen is from an area just outside Tucumcari. So I personally, I love this photo because I've been trying to find the location. And as a result of work that Department of Ag has done in the area. Most of that is under conservation reserve pastures now. And so I can't actually find the location because I can't find any. I can get about within 5 miles, but everything else is nice, lush green pasture land now. So we've come a long way. Originally in 1935, when our program started here in New Mexico, we were established as the Albuquerque Plant Nursery. We had 14,000 acres that we leased from Sandia Pueblo. On those 14,000 acres, at that time, the program focus was primarily to evaluate all types of plants for conservation uses, and then actually to grow and disseminate those plants to be used by other organizations such as the Civilian Conservation Corps. Nationwide, that effort ended in 1952. And we have a really interesting history here in New Mexico because when that effort ended, the program manager, our program manager here in the state, he was already starting to develop a partnership with New Mexico State University. He already saw that we had potential to have a collaboration between NRCS and the university. And so when the program closed, knowing that in the future we had a really good chance of having a collaborative effort, he actually took all the plant materials and stored them at his house. I mean, all the seed went in the garage. He actually had a bunch of tree seedlings that he stored. It was quite a bit of personal commitment. That commitment paid off in 1957 when we came to our present location in Los Lunas. Out of the 25 plant materials centers nationwide, we are the only one that is run as a full partnership between our plant materials program and a land grant university agricultural science center. We have 200 acres here that we share with the university, and it's truly a shared effort. The way we look at that is of the 200 acres we have to operate on, there are about 40 acres of infrastructure that is obviously shared because we share offices, buildings, etc. But when you get out in the fields, we share those too. One of the unique things that's kind of a feedback loop, if any of y'all are able to visit the center at some time, we have a lot of older trees, particularly windbreak type trees, planted around the facility. Those are the same trees that were saved back in 1952 when our old program manager was looking forward to the future. So we have quite a history here. Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit first about our conservation plant releases. Now, what we do when we look at improving conservation plants, what we're really looking at is at selecting currently and into the future native plants that can be used to achieve conservation goals. We do, and I'll get a little bit more in the weeds in a second on how kind of the time involved in doing this. We select plants, and sometimes, especially with the early releases, we went to specific sites, found individual groups of a species that had desirable characteristics, took that seed, brought it back, and essentially just planted it, did seed increases, and then did a plant release, which is not quite a varietal release. It's like a pre-varietal release, as all of ours are, but it is a selection of the native plants that have unique characteristics. We have other releases that I'll give an example later. They're really are an amalgamation of phenotypes from across the region. And there's some benefits to both. For things, for instance, like the Elida Sam blue stem that our release brochure is showed here. The benefit for Elida is that it grows really well, kind of down in that east central region of the state, and further east. And so it's very locally adapted. I talked a little about, I hinted that we have conservation uses for all of ours. When we do a release, a document such as this, we publish it and we update it yearly. And the conservation uses are listed. ELIDA has some of the really common ones. For us, erosion control is always a big thing because as an agency that was born out of the Dust Bowl, we're very sensitive to erosion. Forage value, that's also big to NRCS because we do work closely with farmers and ranchers. And so having good forage value is important to them while we still are achieving other conservation benefits, such as wildlife habitat, which I think would be particularly interesting to this group. So we evaluate all of these different uses, and actually before we do the initial seed collections, we decide, what are we looking for? What type of plant? What are our desired conservation goals when we're using a particular plant as a tool on the landscape? So altogether, we have 41 plant releases from the New Mexico Center. We actually have more releases than any of the other plant materials centers in the nation. We're pretty proud of that. 26 of those are grasses. 11 are trees and shrubs. 4 are forbs. In the picture here, I've got a photo that was taken about 2 months ago of Grenville switchgrass. Grenville was one of our first releases that we did back in 1940. It's still being used today. The preponderance of the releases that we have put out are still in use for conservation efforts across the region. And we're pretty proud of that track record because you like to see that your work has some staying power. I did put together a little timeline chart that includes all of our releases. Our first ones were right in about 1940. And we kind of peaked between about the 60s and the early 2000s. The reason for that peak is what we look at are plants that are common on the landscape that can be used as tools. And so by about the mid 2000s, we had hit most of the really common ones, particularly with grasses for New Mexico and the surrounding states. You will notice that over on the right, I do have a future release we're not quite to 2025 when this one's going to come out. We're getting there. I'll talk about that. That's a pretty unique situation there. And timeline, just looking at this doesn't really give us quite the complete picture of what it takes to get from when we collect seed to where we can actually do a release. I should explain a little bit what I mean when I say do or produce a release. What our function is that essentially as the breeder of these improved native plants, we provide breeder seed to the seed growing market. They in turn use that seed to grow more seed over the years, and that's what goes on the market. With natives, there are some real economic benefits to that, simply because it's less expensive for a seed grower to grow seed in a farmland situation than it is for them to harvest native seed. In addition to that, when they're growing our releases, they know that these plants have specific desirable traits. That seed, in turn, over the years, has been used across the region, mainly from our Center for Rangeland Restoration. One of our big pushes was a partnership between NRCS and BLM called Restore New Mexico, where we did rangeland improvement. Last time I checked in, we had actually treated over 2 million acres in the state. So back to the chart. What this shows is The start dates are when we initially collected the seeds. The end dates are when we did a release. On average, it's about 15 to 20 years of work for us to actually take some of these plants, evaluate their characteristics, decide what would be desirable, and decide if they're actually meeting those conservation goals that we have. So that's kind of an overview of our conservation plant release portion of the program. Other things we do are involved with conservation plant technology. I should explain what that is. For us, it's really doing the groundwork to develop practical methods to where, for the most part, if you're planting something, how do you do that so that you're successful and you meet specific conservation goals? We had roughly just under 40 years of work out of this center that we specifically looked at riparian restoration in the Southwest. As a result of those work, we developed some new planting methods or improved old planting methods, both for bare root stock, as in the illustration in the upper left, and with containerized stock. We've got several publications out on how to do this. A great example that we have in central New Mexico of how successful this can be is illustrated in this picture. That's on Bosque de Apache National Wildlife Refuge. Most of what was planted there, which is pretty much most of the refuge, was the result of the work that we were doing in collaboration with them. Another big effort that we had was actually evaluating pollinator plants for pollinators and beneficial insect. We had a multi-year study we did on that. That resulted in quite a few publications. Everything from, we have 2 pocket guides, one's to beneficial insects, the other's to pollinators. That was a joint publication between us and New Mexico State. The one that's on the screen is just recommendations on what species are desirable for New Mexico. And then we've got another publication on how to actually plant these things and be successful at it in a real world setting where we're looking at conservation goals. Another type, and this is really sort of a basic one, is we've developed seeding guidelines, sort of how-to manuals to really teach both our own staff, cooperators, and the public to, if you're going to be planting, how do you do this? This particular publication is gauged towards rangelands. Semi-arid and arid rangelands are really challenging to seed. And so we do the groundwork behind these. And when I say that, I mean, we do an awful lot of actual applied field work. We test the methods, see what works best. We get all the science, pull it together, and do these projects that result in these technical publications that are really good educational tools. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our current projects. The first one, what's on your screen now, this is a field of vine mesquite. When I showed the chart earlier and I mentioned that we had one future release that we hope to have out within the next couple of years, it is this vine mesquite. Vine mesquite, this project, is a really good example of how we do a plant release so that it has robust adaptability across the landscape. This particular project started back in the 1980s. At that time, we did seed collections from 80 different areas. It matches up nicely to have 80 in the 80s. We did initial seed collections that were field evaluated to look for specific, where there were good stands. Brought those back. We've been developing this release for some time. It did sort of sit on the shelf for a few years. We're finally at the stage where we're trying to finish it up. What this final release is that instead of being really highly bred for specific characteristics, it's a mix of phenotypes. And so the goal is that wherever vine mesquite would naturally occur on the landscape, but is missing and you would want to replace it, or it's just not as abundant as you would like to meet your conservation goals, this particular mix, there should be something in it that will successfully establish and produce good results. Now, I mentioned that we kind of set this one on the shelf for a while. And the reason for it was at the time, this is a fairly difficult grass to deal with for doing, for instance, rangeland restoration work. It's easy to grow, but hard to harvest. It's easy to plant, but the quality of the seed varies greatly. So we got to a point, I think it was about 10 years ago, where we kind of thought, this one's not really ready to hit the market and get back into that feedback loop, because commercial growers just aren't going to be willing to grow more of this seed. So it would be available to us as conservationists to use on projects, because it just didn't seem viable. Well, what we missed was that the commercial growers are still out there. They've got a customer base, including folks like my own agency, who realize vine mesquite is a missing tool in our toolbox. So the growers were going out and harvesting wild seed. This particular species is challenging to do seed increases on in a controlled setting like we have here, but it's even more challenging when you're harvesting wild seed. And because of those challenges, it got to where the market price for vine mesquite seed recently was about $130 a pound. And that's not because the seed growers were making a lot of money selling it back to federal agencies. That's just because it was expensive to do when you're harvesting wild seed. So we've recently decided we're going to make a new commitment to get this on the market so we can bring that cost down and thus make conservation more approachable using vine mesquite as a tool. We're pretty excited about this. By the way, if y'all are familiar with vine mesquite, you've seen it out on New Mexico rangelands, you've probably never seen a stand that looks like this. And I think we have some of the nicest looking vine mesquite in the state. We're pretty proud of it. Another current project, I mentioned that one of our national priorities is to look at cover crops. We're approaching that in New Mexico a little differently than what's being done nationally. The goal when a farmer plants a cover crop is to get as diverse as possible a mixture of species in that planting to increase biodiversity, which provides increased ecosystem services. The drawback in a place like New Mexico is that those mixes with a lot of different species in them aren't a marketable crop for ag producers. And so in most cases, they just decide not to plant them. So what we're looking at currently here at the center is we've got a 5-year study where we're actually growing a mix of forage crop species. The reasons behind that are that forage crops are New Mexico's largest crops. That's where our ag industry has its base. So the producers here are familiar with them, and our hope is that they'll plant them in a mix. It's not, our mix actually only has 2 different species in the mix, but it is a grass and legume. You do get some increased ecosystem services just by increasing just a little bit of biodiversity. So the way we're approaching this is that if we've got a farmer out there who, if he only had 2 choices between growing a traditional single species cover forage crop or growing a cover crop mix that may have a dozen species in it, he's only going to grow the single species monoculture. What we're looking at developing is giving him a choice of something that still provides some ecosystem services, still has some forage value, and so we can really play both games at the same time. The top picture is one of our plantings here at the center. That's a mixture of forage corn and forage peas. The bottom picture threw that in because this is a collaborative project that we're doing at New Mexico State. Our state forage specialist is actually taking samples out of this, doing real forage analysis. So our hope is when this project is done, we've got some of that in a farmland situation. We can actually approach growers and say, look, you can have the best of both worlds. You can still farm efficiently and productively and provide ecosystem services. We're pretty excited about this one. I realize that for this group, you may not be thinking about particularly farmland when you're thinking about endangered species, but from my standpoint, any piece of land where we can provide positive ecosystem services is a plus for everywhere. Okay, this is moving on, a brand new project. One of the things that we've found is we've got a lot of the people we serve that want to do plantings at smaller scales. And that's everything from, urban agriculture people to traditional farmers to ranchers. And so what we're looking at with this project is what can you plant and how do you plant it with UTV? The idea behind this is lots of folks have UTVs. And so this is a project where we're evaluating planting methods using UTV. When we get done with those evaluations, we will go back and analyze what works best, produce the technical guidance so people can actually use these successfully. I know it may not seem that you can cover a lot of landscape with the UTV, but I've actually had ranchers who are super interested in doing this because they may not be able to seed 1,000-acre pasture, but you know what? They've got a UTV and they can seed spots where they see that, critical species are missing. So it's really kind of a unique way to try to get conservation on the ground. So that's kind of my really fast, quick overview of everything. I wanted to go through our program and just give you an overview, then leave it open for questions. So anything you guys want to throw at me, please do. I'm happy to respond as best I can.
Thank you so much, Rick. This has not only been fascinating, and I really appreciate the history, but your presentation is a feast for the eyes too. These are gorgeous pictures. So thanks for that. Ashley Rudolph has her hand raised.
Hi, this was great presentation. I really appreciate all this information. Can you talk a little bit about the need for irrigation? So, and the success of planting seeds and then irrigating and then the weed control, just like what are some of the challenges as practitioners we might be ready to face in terms of getting native seed and seeding it at projects? What are some of those challenges?
Well, you hit on a lot of things that are challenges. Irrigation being one of those. You mentioned weeds. Weeds are also a challenge. Instead of, I'm trying to think more broadly than just irrigation, because irrigation, where you have access to irrigation water, is a great alternative, because even with natives, they really respond well. When I was just showing that slide of vine mesquite, and I mentioned that, I don't think you'd be able to go out anywhere and see a stand of vine mesquite that looks better than the field we have at the center. I'm not bragging. The reason why that field looks good is because we irrigate it. It's pretty simple. All of our plants that are native to this arid landscape we live in, they will respond to water. So irrigation, if you can do it, is a plus. But if you can't do it, then really you need to look at a lot of other factors around planting. This is not a plant materials program project, but I have a collaborative project that we will just be essentially publishing data interpretations this year for the whole state. And the project's with NMSU. And what we're looking at is in a rangeland condition. We've focused on some soil properties that either enhance or don't the soil's inherent ability to store seed over time. And why that's important is that if you understand how well the soil stores seed over time, then you can make better management decisions about whether or not a planting is successful. And I'll dive into this a little deeper, because in our own history as an agency, we've done this when we've done rangeland planting. We would plant one year, go out the next year, and try to decide if that planting had been successful or not. Well, normally after a year, it wasn't. And that was just because we were looking at the wrong time. Because in a specific area over the course of a year, chances are you may not have had sufficient natural precipitation to get those seeds up and established. Sometimes it takes 2 years, sometimes 3 years, sometimes 5 years. And there's a feedback that goes on with the soils. For soils that store seed well, then your seed remains viable over a longer period of time. And so in those areas, you can know that, well, if you won't have, say, good monsoon moisture, maybe you only have it once in a 5-year period. Well, you should still successfully be able to store the seed those. There are some soils that we have that they're just going to be challenging. They're not going to store the seed well. And so you really have to think about, maybe instead of doing broad scale seeding, doing more targeted seeding. I showed our project with UTVs earlier. Part of what's built into that project is that if you're seeding an area where you're relying on precipitation, you could really target seeding to areas where maybe you've got a little more run on moisture. So the whole irrigation question gets pretty complicated really fast. I do want to hit on something else you mentioned, which is weeds. When I train our field staff for NRCS across the state, our new people, one of the things I actually train them on is that when they go out and seed something, or when they go out and disturb the soil in any manner at all, they should expect it to turn into a weedy mess. That's just naturally going to happen because most of our soils will typically have, under normal management, a fairly good weed seed bank built up in the soil. And when you disturb that soil, you activate that seed bank. And so the lesson in that is that weeds will happen. And so in your management, you need to plan on how are you going to manage the weeds through that first several few years where you're trying to get your planting successful. A common way to do that would be to plant, the first year you're going to have weeds, something as simple as mowing, because not all, but most of our weedy species here are annuals. And if you mow them and keep them from producing more seed over a period of a few years, generally you can knock them back so that the desirable species you planted can be more successful. So I know that was a long-winded answer, but I hope that answers your questions.
All right, thank you for that question, Ashley, and thanks for that answer. So Andrew, if you can hang on for just 1 second, I wanted to get to Yasmin because she had typed a question into the chat earlier. And Yasmin, do you want me to read your question or do you just want to read it yourself or follow up?
Hi, I actually had a few other questions, so let Andrew go first. That's fine.
Oh, okay, thanks. Go ahead, Andrew.
Hey, thanks, Yasmin and Catherine. Hi, Rick. First off, I want to say hello to you from one of your old-time friends, Mark Briggs, who speaks highly of you.
Well, I think the world of Mark. So
well, nice. And I don't have as much of a question, but just kind of an invitation to collaborate.
Okay.
So right across the river from you is the Valencia Soil and Water Conservation District's Whitfield Wildlife Conservation Area. And we're in the midst of a collaboration with Mark and people up in the Fort Collins Science Center. We just put in a proposal to the South Central Cask entitled Climate and Fire Adapted Restoration in the Middle Rio Grande. So we're really trying to expand. In essence, one of the big things we're doing is putting forth a practical manual that will provide a native plant list with a matrix that provides traits and affinities for what do we know in the literature and in research for how these plants perform, whether it's salinity tolerances, depth to groundwater, flammability. We also have an ethnobotanical component to it to get cultural relevance. So I just want to say we're super excited. We hope we get funded, but everything you've talked about this morning just shouts out to me that we should have been talking with you all along, but really want to establish. I want to come visit you. You come visit us. Let's see if we can't connect some dots, because there's a lot of overlap in the work we're doing and what you all have been doing these many years.
Yeah, let's get back together and talk. We've got a long history with Whitfield. A lot of the natives that were originally planted there came from our Plant Materials Center.
Right. Well, yeah, let's reconnect. I love the idea. Thank you.
Yep, let's do that.
Okay.
All right, thanks so much, Andrew. Okay, go ahead, Yasmin.
Thanks, Catherine. Hi, Richard. I'm not sure if we've met before, but I had the pleasure and privilege of working for many years with Greg Fenchel and Dave Dreesen on a lot of their riparian research and restoration work. And in fact, they did a lot of projects on Rio Grande Conservancy property with us and with various partners. And so, there's been kind of the Plant Materials Center used to grow tall pots and plants for riparian plantings. And I'm very excited to hear about vine mesquite. Actually, it's one of my favorite grasses. And I think we could all use, a little bit more guidance in grass restoration. It's not easy, especially, I appreciate your comments on weeds and weed control, because we don't always have the tools available in places like the Bosque, to do mowing and things like that. So it kind of calls for more caution in terms of what we do with disturbance there. But what do you see as the kind of the future of the PMC, do you see sort of exporting these technologies and working more with private nurseries, or do you see yourself getting back into the plant production, seed production game? I've seen some nursery folks utilize some of the the tall pot technologies and stuff, but I'm not really sure how many are doing that.
That's a really a good question and an interesting one for me, because we did, as you're aware, produce nursery stock for years and years and years. The challenge that we got into is technically that type of work is outside of our mission area, was part of the challenge. Our mission really is more R&D, not production.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that we were doing that I think actually slowed down there being more private nursery production of tall pots, for instance, was that we were providing them at extremely low cost or no
Right.
cost.
Right.
And so it's a little hard for entities like, for instance, Santa Ana Pueblo has a great program they're getting off the ground. Well, it'd be really hard for a group like that to compete against the federal government when, just on an economic end. And so one of the ways that, it's kind of a bitter pill for everybody to swallow. One of the ways we can encourage there being more stuff on the market is for us not to be providing it and undercutting the market. So we are still, because we have so much history and, such good technical knowledge of how to do that type of production, we are more than happy to work with anybody to help them get their feet off the ground. And so that, yeah, it's a challenge, but I think there are some folks that are starting to grow, more natives in the area. So we'll continue to work with, we'll be happy to work with any of those people to help satisfy needs for y'all and other partners. And so I think I have not answered all of your question. I'm going to be honest with you, but what was the other parts of your question, please?
No, that's totally fine, Richard. I hear what you're saying about, competing sort of with, the subsidization from the federal government with private nurseries. But, the research that you've done and the technologies you've developed are really useful and important. And, how do we encourage more people to get into the nursery game, especially with the major reforestation needs that we have, after burns and things like that. And like you said, some of the rangeland restoration.
It's interesting because coming out of last year, our huge burn historic fire year, it's a really good time, I think, to have conversations with those folks about why they may want to get into this type of production. And I think part of those conversations would be to actually talk with them about the economics of it. Because tell them we've got agencies lined up that are customers. And explain that to them, that it's more economically viable now, not only as a result of fires, but also as we're looking at climate mitigation. Things have changed, and so there's more of a market now. Now, as far as where we are within our plant materials program, we did all of that work on that type of production. We have the guidance, we have the knowledge to disseminate that to people. We're now moving on to looking at new types of plant technology, so we can look at addressing current and future needs. And so that's one of the challenges of a program like this is that our job is really to create new stuff. And with that, in the case of plant-related technology, we still have to be able to step up to the plate and train people. Now, on the other side of what we do, I mentioned those 41 releases of improved conservation plants that we have. As the breeder of those plant materials, we've got to grow and maintain all of those. And that's a balance that I'll be honest with you, we did not do well enough in the past because we got so deeply into new plant technology products that we didn't maintain our breeder seed stock. And that has hurt us throughout the state because I mentioned earlier, there is a feedback loop. After we do a release to the market turns around and makes that seed available to us for restoration projects. It got to the point where there were a lot of really good conservation plants that we had released out of the center that you could not buy seed from. And the reason for that is because we no longer were growing breeder seed that growers could take an increase into market seed. So there's a real balance in the work we have to do because we have to do both. And so we've made a real commitment now to, particularly for grasses, because those have been our most useful conservation plants coming out of the center. Our goal is to have all of our active grass releases established in breeder seed blocks here at the facility. We're a little under halfway there now, so we've got some more work to do. But all of this is really a balance, but we're trying to do as much as we possibly can to meet as many needs as we can.
Thanks, Richard. Appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Yasmin. Katie, you had your hand up, but really quickly, I just wanted to shout out to Dana Price for putting some links in the chat for some of the publications that you mentioned, Rick. So thank you, Dana. And Katie, did you still want to ask your question?
Oh gosh, I was flooded with questions, but Rick has answered them all. I'm just really stewing on the idea of that they're about R&D, not production. So I think he's made that message resonate loud and clear. So I guess I'll just pitch a softball one. Rick, is the center open for tours? And if so, how do we go about arranging that?
Contact me or our Plant Materials Center manager. Her name's Jirai Mon. Contact either. Boy, are we are thrilled to do tours. We're very proud of the work we've done here. And the most effective way we can teach people about how conservation plants and plantings can be used is to actually get them out here and show them. So, Katie, if y'all want to come out or if anyone wants to come out, please do.
So I'll jump in.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Katie. I'll jump in and say if folks on this call are interested in a tour so that poor Rick doesn't have to deal with lots of individual tours, if you all want to contact us, I'm sure we can work to put a field trip together and we can coordinate, Rick, if that sounds good. I don't know what your max number of visitors is.
Let's do that.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think I can kind of get a feel for about the size of the group we're talking about.
Okay.
Probably 10, 15 folks max.
Okay.
That's a pretty easy tour for us to give.
Great. Because I want to come too.
And when we do that, we've got sort of a standard let's go over everything tour that show off everything we have done and are doing. That works pretty well as an introduction, but if you've got a group that you have specific interest,
right,
we can focus just on that.
Okay.
If you, for instance, back to the question of when you do plantings and you have weed problems. Well, guess what? We do too. And I'd love to give a tour on managing weeds. And so whatever your interests are, let us know.
Okay, well, yeah, this is a call for all of you to contact us and let us know your specific interests, and we'll compile all of those, and then I can work directly with Rick and coordinate that field trip and get Debbie on it. She's our logistics master. So thank you for that offer, Rick. Grace, you have your hand up?
Yeah, real quick. This was really interesting and out of my sphere of influence. I'm a hydrologist with the Interstate Stream Commission, Rich. And I'm kind of curious, have you guys started working with New Mexico State and others on cover crops for areas that are being considered for forbearance down in the Lower Rio Grande? And kind of curious too with Casey-ish, whether maybe with the MRGCD, you guys are talking with them, because it seems like it'd be a good potential if there's crops that use less water, that might be a good option for some of these farmers to be able to utilize their lands, but also get some gain out of water conservation.
Yeah, for those particular producers, have them, encourage them to contact our local office to where they are.
Mm-hmm.
Because we can do conservation planning for all of that, which, it's just our public service freebie we do for producers. But on top of that, for producers who qualify for our cost share programs, we can actually cost share on a lot of that.
Okay.
Cover crops you mentioned, cover
Mhm.
crops, something that we cost share on through the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. And
Okay.
so, yeah, that's all very doable, Grace.
Do you know if it's being done so far, if it's kind of gotten talked about? Because I know we have a pilot program that's just finishing up, and now we're going into a much larger, much higher number. So I was just curious if you'd heard if there'd been some connection already with your shop, or should I pass that information along to our managers?
There's been some work that we've done with individual producers.
Okay. So it's more individual than it is like a program wide kind of outreach. So that could be something we could help with.
Yeah, well, of course, if we had our way, Grace, we would be working with everybody.
Yeah, great. Okay.
But there's some of the, some challenges there. And one of them is just really educating those producers.
Yeah.
We are thrilled to see that we've had some producers who've adopted, and we actually got the Plant Materials Centers doing cover crop demonstrations, and one of them's in the Truth of Consequences area.
Okay.
And that's turned into a really good outreach tool, because the particular producer is the type of person who was willing to try something new. And when he saw that it worked, it was willing to tell all of his friends and neighbors that it works.
Yeah, that's great, because I do think there might be, I don't know enough about the program, but there might be some requirements for cover crops, but I'm not quite sure. So I'll just pass on that information, and hopefully there'll be more, if there isn't already, more interaction on getting that going, and kind of interested in the Middle Rio Grande too, getting that started.
Yeah, we would like to see more going on with cover crops. But the forage / cover crop project, Plant Materials Program is working on, that I went through earlier, that's really targeted towards some of those producers who are hesitant to make the jump into a full cover crop system, because it's kind of a transitional step. The example I gave a talk in southwestern Colorado last year, and in that area, they've really adopted cover crops and no-till and all kinds of stuff. And they were asking, what's it like in New Mexico? And I used Eastern New Mexico as an example. What it's like is we've got a wind erosion program. And so if I can get a producer to get something planted so the soil's not in the air, that's a win. I had the same attitude about our forage / cover crop project we're doing here at the Plant Materials Center. It won't provide all the ecosystem services that a full-blown cover crop system will. But if a producer will do it, it will provide more ecosystem services than just growing a monoculture crop.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thank you, Grace. I think that's all the questions that we had in the chat. Did anyone else want to ask Rick a question before we drop off?
Catherine, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go ahead.
Not a question, but I'm typing furiously, so I beat the 11 o'clock mark up. I'll be dropping some information about NMDA's Healthy Soil program in the chat.
Oh, excellent.
And it's very, very related to the cover crops conversation going on. So I just want to make people aware that the state does have a program to fund grants that involve anything from cover cropping to bale grazing to applying compost or mulch. Basically, any practice that would improve the soil we would consider for funding. And there's, as Andrew Hautzinger at Valencia SWCD could speak to, we fund individual land managers, companies, nonprofits, clear up to local governmental entities. And in fact, we funded a project through MRGCD, I believe it was in the last funding cycle. So there may be others on the call who are not aware, and I'll be dropping information for you in the chat. So we hope you'll get subscribed to the e-newsletter, and we'll keep you up to date on application dates and that sort of thing via that newsletter. So thank you very much for letting me take the liberty.
Excellent. Thank you, Katie. We appreciate that. And we might be contacting you to do a seminar.
I would welcome it. Thank you very much, Catherine.
Okay, thanks. That's great. All right, anybody else? Comment or question? All right, well, thank you all so much for attending, and thank you, Rick, for all this information. This has been great. I think it's opened up a lot of opportunities, and we look forward to visiting your center.
All right, get in contact with me because we love having folks out. And thanks for inviting me to talk. It's been good talking with everybody.
Excellent. And before you go, can you maybe drop your email in the chat for folks that want to ask you questions?
I will do that right now.
Excellent. Thank you.